recognize that visual culture is a place where it's contentious about us and them and who we are supposed to affiliate ourselves with in each ad that we see, and the way in which certain bodies are kind of placed in kind of certain positions to signify many things. And that's what I find why I find it's as important as any other art form. But I've also really been fascinated with the way signs function in other spaces, like political movements. This idea of positivity and keeping the faith. But this is an image from 1960. So again, me being a visual culture archaeologist, I'm looking through magazines. So I'm looking for ads, but I'm like, wait, that's interesting. And this was an image in Life magazine in 1965, and it said two little prisoners. And again, I've made it into a mirror where you can see the image, but it's how did this image come to be? You know, of how did they become? It speaks to me about how certain people can become framed as public enemy number one at a very young age, and does this moment and these kinds of images shape not only the officer's relationship to these boys, but also their relationship to the people who are supposed to protect and serve them, and also thinking about older people who were still fighting for their rights. So Amelia Boynton Robinson, who was 55 years old, and still fighting for her right to vote in 1965, and was attacked by the state for trying to exercise her right of assembly. And this, I used photographs by James Spider Martin, and I turned them into mirrors to reflect on the Selma March that he photographed, and which was fascinating. We see young John Lewis, who's now a United States congressperson, leading this march of people from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, in the spirit of making liberty and justice for all a reality. And we saw the confrontation and the injustice that the justice served in response to that. And with these works, when you normally see them, you see yourself reflected in them. You see as a mirror, and that is part of why I'm always thinking about trying to find ways to see myself and others in relationship to the past, because we think we're in a special moment, and it is special, but it's part of much larger, greater movement for all of us to be free. And thinking about men like this person who walked 50 miles on one leg, for other people's rights, for me is something that I am always kind of so inspired by and challenged by. And it reminds me of a quote by Audre Lorde, who said, "There's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." He said, Malcolm knew this, Martin knew this. Our struggles are particular, but we're not alone. And our connection to other people's struggles is going to actually allow for greater opportunity and freedom for all of us. And the disconnection from that, the fact that these women put on their Sunday's best and went out to protest the protesters because they were afraid of what might happen to them. But these men who came together and held hands in solidarity in spite of it all are things that I think we can learn a lot from. There's an artist named Nicholas Lobo from South Africa who said, we need to live in tomorrow before we get there. That way we won't be surprised when we get there. And that's a challenge. He said the challenge with South Africa post-apartheid was that people weren't living in the freedom that they wanted. So when it happened, they didn't know what to do with it. And that, again, what is the freedom that we want? And I also then look at images of people and serious kind of perilous situations as protesters or making the state know that they have issues, which is also a responsibility. Not doesn't mean that you want to get rid of the state to challenge it. We critique things to make them better, not to make them worse. But this idea of someone who put their arm through a breathing hole, um, not knowing what could happen to them, not knowing if it would ever mean anything to anyone, as a symbol of solidarity and unity, was astounding to me, because we know the South African police were not the nicest of police, and this was taken in 1991 by a photographer named Catherine Ross. And it was so surreal to me and that I wanted to remake it as a sculpture. So I kind of I worked with a special effects studio to remake the arm in this hyper real format to kind of capture that specific moment. And then I looked around the other side of the photograph and saw these other really poetic, beautiful gestures and messages that people were sending as they were being hauled off. And again, thinking about what the power is of collectivity when we come together, and when people come together, that's when societies change, when countries change. It's not governments that actually make the change. It's actually the willingness of people to kind of cross any other challenges that they might have with one another to actually come together. This was an image that I had a different feeling about. I actually always felt guilty looking at it. It was by a photographer named Ernest Withers. I always felt guilty because I was constantly gawking at their butts. And so I felt in looking at the image, I was kind of reimposing this oppression. And so I decided to uh, make it as a sculpture. And when I made it as a sculpture, I cropped it at the shoulders and I gave it a new title. I titled it Raise Up. And then somehow, well, 6 months after I made the sculpture, this piece well, the events in Ferguson, Missouri happened, and this piece, when I showed it in the United States, was framed as the hands up, don't shoot piece. And it was astounding to me that something that I made about something that happened 50 years ago and halfway across the world could, in a way, speak eloquently to something that was going to happen, in the center of the place where I come from. And that also speaks to this question of like continuity and the then and now and what things that should have never happened and should never happen again, but are continuing to happen. So my work with as a photographer is really taking various forms because I realize that there's images that can speak to what we need to do to cross these borders and break down the walls.